Freddie almost didn't go that day. He could barely speak, let alone sing. And yet, somehow, when he stepped onto that stage, he became larger than life again. It was the day Queen were reborn, and he knew it.
The morning of July 13th, 1985 should have felt electric. Instead, it was tense. Freddie Mercury sat in silence at the breakfast table of his London home, a cup of tea growing cold beside him. His throat ached, every swallow reminding him that a doctor had already warned, "Don't sing today." At Wembley Stadium, the air buzzed with anticipation. More than 72,000 people poured into the stands, unaware that the band many of them had grown up with was hanging by a thread. Inside Queen's dressing room, the energy was oddly quiet. Nervous tuning, small talk, glances that lingered too long. They had not performed together in months. Their relationships were strained, their reputation bruised. Outside, Bob Geldof paced, barking orders and making sure the day's impossible schedule held together. He still wasn't convinced Queen should even be on that stage. Too old, too over, he'd once said. But promoter Harvey Goldsmith had insisted, they'll wake the crowd when everyone else is fading. Back in the room, Brian May checked his guitar cables one last time. He looked over at Freddie, who was rolling his shoulders, warming up softly under his breath. There was something defiant in his eyes, quiet but unmistakable. At precisely 6:41 p.m., the stage manager knocked. "Queen, you're on." Freddie stood, slipped on his white jacket, and simply said, "Let's show them we're not done yet." As he stepped into the sunlight, the roar of the crowd swallowed every doubt. None of them knew it yet, but this was the moment that would save Queen and make rock and roll history. Before that July afternoon, Queen were a shadow of the band that once ruled the world. Fame, exhaustion, and frustration had done their quiet damage. The tours had grown longer, the headlines colder, and the chemistry that once felt effortless now required effort to fake. By 1984, their success in America had faded. Hot Space had confused fans who didn't understand Freddie's fascination with funk and disco. MTV had changed the rules, and Queen, once untouchable, that wasn't suddenly looked out of step. When they filmed I Want to Break Free, the British audience loved the humor. But in the US, the drag costumes weren't funny. They were scandalous. The video was banned, radio play plummeted, and for the first time, Queen's confidence cracked. Then came the South Africa controversy. Against a UN boycott, they played Sun City, a decision that haunted them for years. The criticism was harsh. The media that once celebrated them now questioned their ethics, and even fans began to turn away. Inside the band, things weren't better. Freddie was pulling toward his solo career. John Deacon barely spoke in interviews. Roger Taylor seemed angry at everything. And Brian May was quietly burning out. Rehearsals felt mechanical. Friendship had turned into contract. Still, beneath the tension, there was something unspoken. A stubborn spark that refused to die. Each of them knew deep down that the name Queen still meant something. They just didn't know if they still meant it together. That was the atmosphere when the call for Live Aid came. A show meant to save lives, but that would unknowingly save them too. The phone call that would change everything almost never got answered. When Bob Geldof began assembling the lineup for Live Aid, he wanted names that would fill stadiums and televisions around the world. Bowie, Elton John, Paul McCartney, legends who could guarantee eyes on the cause. But when promoter Harvey Goldsmith suggested Queen, Geldof didn't hesitate to disagree. "No," he said flatly. "They've peaked. They're done." Goldsmith pushed back. He'd seen what Queen could do live, how they could turn a restless crowd into an army. He argued that the afternoon lineup would lose energy and that only a band like Queen could revive it. After weeks of debate, Geldof relented, muttering, "Fine, but don't expect much." Inside Queen's circle, the reaction was mixed. Roger was intrigued, Brian cautious, John indifferent. Freddie, however, wanted nothing to do with it. His solo album, Mr. Bad Guy, was about to launch, and his focus was elsewhere. The idea of a chaotic charity show, dozens of bands fighting for minutes, didn't appeal to him. But Brian saw something bigger. During a tense meeting at Garden Lodge, he looked at Freddie and said softly, "If we wake up the next morning and we weren't there, we'll regret it for the rest of our lives." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Freddie smiled. That sharp, knowing smile that always meant trouble and brilliance in equal measure. "All right, darling," he said. "Let's give them the show they'll never forget." And just like that, Queen was in. When Queen finally agreed to perform, the excitement didn't erase the tension. They hadn't played together in months. The air between them was still fragile. Too much unsaid, too much pride swallowed in silence. But the challenge was irresistible. A 20-minute set, no more, no less. Every second had to matter. They couldn't just show up and play. They had to prove something. To the world, and maybe to each other. They rented out the Shaw Theatre in London, transforming it into a private laboratory of sound. Every morning, Freddie arrived in sunglasses and silence. Brian unpacked his guitar with the precision of a surgeon. Roger adjusted his snare until it felt alive, and John quietly plugged in his bass, never one for words, but always the heartbeat of the room. Freddie was relentless. He moved through the songs like a director rehearsing a play, cutting intros, tightening transitions, blending melodies until the set felt seamless. Bohemian Rhapsody, Radio Gaga, Hammer to Fall, Crazy Little Thing Called Love, We Will Rock You, We Are the Champions. One story told in 20 minutes. We wanted no dead space, Brian would later recall. Even Freddie's crowd work had to fit the rhythm. Every gesture was timed. Even the chaos had a pulse. The band's unity began to return through those rehearsals. Laughter replaced silence. The spark they'd lost found its way back into the room. By the final day, Freddie slammed the piano lid shut and grinned. "Gentlemen," he said, "I think we've just remembered who we are." What none of them knew was that this precision, this reborn chemistry, was about to collide with chaos on the day of the show. The morning of Live Aid began with silence. Not the calm kind, the kind that feels heavy, like the world is waiting for something to go wrong. Freddie woke up with a familiar sting in his throat. The pain was sharp, the same burning reminder he'd felt years before when doctors found the vocal nodules. He'd refused surgery back then, terrified it might change his voice. That impossible, soaring voice that couldn't move between tenderness and thunder in a single breath. Now, on the biggest day of his career, it was betraying him. A doctor visited his home that morning and warned him plainly, "Don't sing." Freddie just smiled faintly. "Darling, if I cancel, they'll kill me." He sipped warm honey water and refused to speak for hours, saving every ounce of his voice for one thing, the performance. Meanwhile, at Wembley, the crew scrambled to fix sound levels and transitions between acts. Queen hadn't even done a sound check, but their engineer, Trip Koloff, had a plan. He adjusted the limiters on the mixing board, pushing Queen's volume higher than any other act that day. "When we hit that first chord," Brian May would later recall, "we wanted the crowd to feel it in their bones." By early afternoon, Freddie's throat was still raw, but his mind was set. He looked in the mirror, ran a hand through his hair, and whispered, "Showtime." He wasn't sure if his voice would last 20 minutes, but he was sure of one thing. He wouldn't go quietly. The sun over Wembley was blinding that afternoon. Golden, hot, and unrelenting. 72,000 people filled the stadium, their voices rolling like waves. Most were restless. The day had been long, the performances uneven. The air felt tired. Then, without fanfare, 4 silhouettes stepped into the light. Brian, Roger, John, and Freddie. He walked with that unmistakable strut. Chest high, chin up, the white tank top catching the sunlight. In one hand, a half microphone stand, like a sword he'd carried his whole life. The crowd cheered, but even then they didn't know what was coming. Freddie turned toward the band, counted silently, and Bohemian Rhapsody began. The first notes rang through the stadium, familiar yet electric. It wasn't loud yet, not overwhelming, but something about it cut through the heat and noise. The cameras zoomed in, sweat on his brow, fire in his eyes. He wasn't just singing, he was commanding. Every phrase had purpose, every pause perfectly placed. From the very first line, Brian May would later recall, you could feel it. Something clicked. The energy came back, like we'd never been gone. Then came Radio Gaga. The synth pulsed, Roger's drums thundered, and Freddie lifted his hands above his head. 1 clap, 2. The audience followed, perfectly instantly. 70,000 hands moving in unison. No one had rehearsed it. No one needed to. In that moment, Queen stopped being a band. They became a phenomenon. Freddie glanced toward the sky and smiled, his voice soaring. The fatigue, the fear, the pain, gone. What began as a 20-minute slot was turning into something eternal, and it was only halfway through. The set unfolded like a story Freddie had been writing his whole life. A story told not with words, but with command. From the opening chords of Bohemian Rhapsody, there was no hesitation. His voice, unstrained that morning, now roared with defiance. Every note sounded like a declaration. We're still here. The song ended abruptly, no operatic middle, just a punch straight into Radio Gaga. The crowd clapped in perfect rhythm, a living heartbeat echoing across Wembley. It wasn't just music, it was communion. Freddie grinned mid-song, eyes glimmering with disbelief. He had them, not just listening, but believing. Then came Hammer to Fall. Brian's guitar screamed into the summer air, sharp and furious. Freddie stomped, shouted, owned the stage. Even Roger, usually hidden behind his drums, looked out with wide eyes. This wasn't rehearsal energy anymore. It was resurrection. By the time we hit Crazy Little Thing Called Love, Brian later said, it felt like the entire stadium was breathing with us. There was no barrier, just connection. When We Will Rock You thundered in, Wembley shook. The stomp stomp clap became a tidal wave. Freddie pointed the microphone to the crowd and watched as they roared it back, louder than the amplifiers themselves. And then, we are the champions. Freddie's voice softened, trembling slightly, but that fragility only made it stronger. It was no longer about ego, and it was gratitude, triumph born from exhaustion. As the final note lingered, Freddie raised his fist high, eyes closed. He didn't bow, he didn't speak. He just stood there, a man who'd given everything and reclaimed everything in 20 minutes. It wasn't a performance. It was a rebirth. When Queen left the stage, the noise didn't fade, and it followed them. The sound of 70,000 voices chanting still echoed through the tunnels of Wembley as Freddie wiped his face with a towel, laughing in disbelief. The band members looked at each other, silent at first. No one spoke. There was only the sound of their own breathing and the distant thrum of the next act trying to follow them. Brian unclipped his guitar and leaned against the wall, still catching his breath. Roger sat down, wide-eyed. John just smiled, small, quiet, knowing. Freddie finally broke the silence with a smirk. Not bad for a bunch of old has-beens, eh? Laughter erupted, the tension of months dissolving in seconds. Out in the broadcast room, Bob Geldof froze in front of the monitors. The phones were lighting up, donations pouring in faster than at any other point in the day. He turned to the staff, eyes wide. Who the hell just went on? Someone asked. Geldof didn't hesitate. Queen. And they've just stolen the whole bloody show. He ran to the TV studio, grabbed the microphone, and shouted into the live feed. You've seen them play their hearts out. Now, open your wallets. Even artists waiting backstage, Bowie, Elton, McCartney, were shaking their heads in amazement. It wasn't competition anymore. It was awe. You could feel it, Brian May later said. Something had shifted. We came off stage as one band again, not four tired men. None of them realized yet that the world had changed in those 17 minutes. But the crowd did. The world watching did. And somewhere deep down, Freddie knew it too. When the camera stopped rolling, the shockwaves didn't. By the next morning, headlines across the world read the same thing. Queen stole Live Aid. The band that many thought was finished had just delivered what critics called the greatest live performance in rock history. Inside the Queen camp, disbelief turned into quiet pride. The phone rang nonstop. Journalists, promoters, record labels, all wanting interviews, opportunities, second chances. Suddenly, Queen wasn't the forgotten band of the early 80s. They were reborn. Brian May later said, "We didn't feel triumphant at first, just relieved. Then the footage came out and we realized it was bigger than us." Even Freddie, who rarely watched his own performances, called the band to his home a few days later. They sat together in the living room at Garden Lodge, watching the broadcast replay. For the first few minutes, no one spoke. Then Freddie smiled. "Darlings, we were magnificent." That night, the old spark between them fully returned. The laughter, the teasing, the creative hunger, all back. A few weeks later, Brian's phone rang. It was Freddie. "Let's get back in the studio," he said. "I'm not done yet." Within months, they began recording again. The sessions that would lead to a kind of magic and the miracle. Their chemistry was alive again, sharpened by gratitude and time. Live Aid hadn't just raised millions for famine relief. It had reignited one of the greatest bands in history. Queen had gone from the brink of ending to a new beginning, proving that sometimes the loudest comeback begins in silence, then right before the lights come on. Years later, Brian May would sit quietly in interviews, still searching for words to describe that day. "We've played hundreds of shows," he said once, but that one was different. It was survival. For Queen, Live Aid wasn't just a concert. It was resurrection. The world saw a flawless 20-minute performance, but behind it were years of exhaustion, tension, and doubt. On that July afternoon, something extraordinary happened. 4 men remembered why they'd started making music in the first place. Freddie had walked onto that stage fragile, his voice uncertain, his future unknown. He walked off untouchable, not just a rock star, but a symbol of defiance and grace. It was the moment we became a band again, Brian recalled. No drama, no arguments, just music. Freddie led, and we followed. The legacy of that day continues to echo. Generations later, new fans still discover that performance and feel as if they're there, clapping with the crowd, shouting the lyrics, feeling the heartbeat of something timeless. For Brian, the greatest pride wasn't in stealing the show, but in the bond it restored. We didn't just save our career, he said softly. We saved each other. And maybe that's why the world still talks about it, because Live Aid wasn't just history. It was proof that even when everything seems lost, one voice, one song, one moment can change everything. If that performance still gives you chills, tell us below which moment hit you the hardest. And subscribe for more untold stories behind the music that changed the world.